Seance on a Wet Afternoon is a British thriller from 1964. Kim Stanley plays a psychic who performs seances for paying customers. She's assisted by her weak-willed husband, played by Richard Attenborough. Stanley thinks a great way to elevate her status as a psychic would be to help the police solve a kidnapping. Stanley then convinces Attenborough to kidnap the child of a rich couple and hide her in their home. From there they help, and I'm saying this in quotations, the police and the couple track down the missing kid. While this is happening, Attenborough starts to notice his wife becoming more unbalanced with each passing day. The film has an unnerving atmosphere that's unlike anything else from this period. It almost feels like a horror film, but without the horror. Don't get me wrong, what these people are doing is horrifying in its own right, but there are no traditional horror setups in this movie. No gore, no jump scares, or anything supernatural. The film is actually pretty grounded. The story seems like something that could happen in real life, which only adds to the overall uneasiness. There's hardly any music on the soundtrack. Most scenes are left with a looming silence that make even the most mundane moments feel a little chilling. It's especially powerful during the seance scenes. It really makes you feel like you're sitting in on one of these things. Kim Stanley's voice is often the only thing heard during these parts, but when something else is heard, it's kind of startling. When you do hear something else, it's actually pretty quiet, but the tension of these scenes is built up so well that they don't need to be loud to catch you off guard. The cinematography is also brilliant. It was shot by Jerry Turpin, whom I had never heard of before, but after seeing this, I kind of want to look into more of his work. Most of the film is comprised of characters talking in rooms, but Turpin transforms all these scenes in a spectacular fashion. Whenever the camera is still, it's always at an interesting and dynamic angle. If the camera's moving, it does so to great effect. The opening shot alone is mesmerizing. It kind of feels like the perspective of the spirit that's just been summoned and is looking around at its new surroundings. But honestly, the best part of the film are the two lead actors. Attenborough and Stanley deliver some powerhouse performances. Richard Attenborough is probably most famous for portraying John Hammond in the Jurassic Park series. I say that because if you didn't know that beforehand, you might not recognize him. Now granted, it's almost 30 years earlier, but Attenborough always had a way of disappearing into his roles. His career spanned almost 70 years, and he was always a chameleon on screen. Every time he acts, I forget I'm watching a performance. This is no exception, and possibly his most complex character. He's meek and definitely a pushover, but not in a typical sense. He isn't the type of man who's constantly berated by a tyrant wife. Quite the opposite, actually. They hardly ever raise their voices at each other. He's weak-willed in his devotion to her. If she wants something, he has a tough time saying no. There are scenes where Stanley is clearly spouting nonsense, and you can tell Attenborough knows it, but he can't seem to bring himself to contradict her. Sometimes he enjoys doing it, as there's clearly some past emotional turmoil that's still affecting their relationship. It almost feels like he's trying to protect her, but at other times you can tell Attenborough knows he shouldn't be telling her what she wants to hear, but he does it anyway. I love these scenes because his face tells us everything we need to know. He's holding back so much, and you think he's gonna blow up at any second, but he rarely does. You can sense he's trained himself after all these years to hold everything together, and that he didn't do this out of necessity, but he did it out of choice. He would rather keep Stanley in his life rather than be emotionally independent. This aspect of his character evokes an eerie realism that's a wonderful addition to the mood of the movie. For me, I think it makes the film that much more enthralling. However, for as much as I'm praising Attenborough, I think the best performance in the film is from Kim Stanley. This could have easily turned into a caricature and been so over the top, but not only does Stanley bring great restraint to her performance, but she adds many subtleties to each scene she's in. Like I said before, you can tell that there are times she talks about stuff that's probably not true, but during these scenes, something always feels off. You never get a clear answer of what's going on, but Stanley makes certain acting choices that allow the viewer to draw their own conclusions. It could be that she's lost sense of reality and we're seeing the beginning stages of her mental deterioration. It could be that she doesn't even believe herself, but she needs her husband's affirmations in her false beliefs. Or it could be that she doesn't believe anything at all, and she's just trying to manipulate her husband further into doing what she wants. Again, this is all just speculation, but I love performances where you can get a different interpretation of the character every time you see it. But even the simpler moments are interesting. The seance scenes alone make this a great performance. Stanley hardly talks above a whisper during these parts, and she has a very unique way of drawing you into the setting. It's been said that Stanley was not the first choice for the role, and that the producers went to Deborah Kerr and Simone Signoret first, who both turned it down. But once they found Stanley, they were wondering how they could have ever thought of anyone else. I agree, because I love Deborah Kerr and Simone Signoret, but Stanley feels like the only one who could bring so many intricacies to this role. And apparently, at the time the film was released, audiences and critics had high praise for Stanley too. She even received her first Oscar nomination for this film. It was the only nomination the movie got. She famously lost to Julie Andrews for Mary Poppins. Kim Stanley was born Patricia Kimberly Reed on February 11th, 1925 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She studied acting in college and moved to California afterwards to study at the Pasadena Playhouse. While there, she adopted the stage name Kim Stanley. Kim was her middle name, and Stanley was her maternal grandmother's maiden name. Not long after that, she attended the Actors Studio and was trained under Elia Kazan and Lee Strasberg. By 1952, she was already starring in leading roles on Broadway and receiving much critical acclaim. She starred in the original productions of The Chase, Picnic, and Bus Stop. She wouldn't star in her first film until 1958's The Goddess, again to much critical acclaim. However, it wasn't enough to attract Stanley to a full-time film career. She preferred live TV or stage work. She only starred in 6 theatrical films. Her most famous role was for her second film, and it's one where you never see her. She was the narrator of the 1962 version of To Kill a Mockingbird. That's one of my favorite movies of all time, and I never knew she was in that until I did my research for this review. After those 2 films, she starred in Seance on a Wet Afternoon, and then an adaptation of Three Sisters in 1966, a role she did on stage 2 years before. Oftentimes, she was offered to reprise stage roles in films, but usually declined. She always felt that if she perfected a role on stage, there was no reason to revisit it for a movie. I guess this was the exception. After that, she took a break from film and starred mainly in TV for 15 years. Then, in 1982, she starred in Frances with Jessica Lange and received a Best Supporting Actress nomination. Funny enough, she lost to Jessica Lange, who won for her supporting role in Tootsie. The following year, Stanley would star in her last movie, The Right Stuff. She had a memorable minor role as Pancho Barnes, the real-life female aviator who famously broke Amelia Earhart's airspeed record in 1930. After that, Kim Stanley starred in one more TV movie, an adaptation of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and mostly retired from acting. She chose to go into teaching and did so in LA, New York, and finally, New Mexico. She would spend her final days there and died on August 20th, 2001. She was 76 years old. 5 years later, a biography of Kim Stanley was published entitled The Female Brando, and that's what she's often referred to nowadays by film scholars. I think it's an accurate statement considering her process and background. Kim Stanley is definitely a talent I wish made more films because each performance brings something new and refreshing. So, if you want to see one of the most interesting yet unnerving films from the 1960s, or discover the work of the female Brando, then I highly recommend Seance on a Wet Afternoon.